Assalamu alaikum dear students, and welcome to the 26th session of the KIPS Distance Learning Program Current Affairs Newspaper Roundup session. I am your host Shahrukh Haider, and the topic for today is the contours of the Corona budget. As you all know, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf government has recently unveiled the federal budget for the financial year 2020 to 2021. Now, as we all understand, we are in very difficult times. The coronavirus pandemic is wreaking havoc all around the world, not just economically, but socially, politically, and on our mental health as well. The economic fallouts of the coronavirus pandemic are very dire, and to date, they have dealt damage which is more pronounced than we have ever seen in our short economic history. People have compared the current economic fallout of the coronavirus pandemic to be more severe than the 1930s global economic crisis, also known as the Great Depression. Now, before we get into the details of the budget that has been recently launched, let's look at what a budget is. So a budget is basically an exercise into statistical modeling, analysis, and projections or predictions of what kind of numbers the government is expecting for the upcoming year. And the interesting thing is that most of these projections are often quite incorrect and off the charts. And this statistical exercise is, according to a lot of critics, a futile exercise, because the kind of numbers that are represented in a budget almost always never reflect the ground realities, reflect the real revenue that has been collected by the government and the real amount of expenditure that has been earmarked by the government in the outgoing financial year. So in the upcoming year, perhaps many critics say that instead of having a yearly budget, we should have monthly reports, which are already prepared by such government institutions as the State Bank of Pakistan, as FBR, as the Ministry of Finance, and these documents are enough to determine the financial health of the country, of the economy, and to pass any laws and legislation regarding the economic side of collective life. So, being a financial year forecast, a budget basically intends to set targets mostly, and these targets are often ballooned or expanded, especially when it comes to the revenue side, by the government to show ambition and to show that the government is really serious about collecting more taxes, whereas in reality, almost every time the government falls short of the projections and the promises that it makes. Moreover, often the real picture of what a budget is basically represented in mini budgets that follow the original budget, which are meant to, in many cases, impose new taxes which were avoided in the initial budget because it was considered too much of a pressure on the public and on the government by the media to have those taxes in place in the first budget. Which is why mini budgets are basically the government telling you that all the promises that we are made, now we are hiding ourselves behind this mini budget and not going to fulfill those promises. Which is why the original budget is often misleading. And in Pakistan, the practice of budget making has been very muddy. It is not accurate, it is not reliable, and the data that has been released on a year-on-year basis has always fallen short of the real data that we get at the end of each financial year. Moreover, the document that you should trust as a CSS aspirant is the Economic Survey of Pakistan. So the Economic Survey of Pakistan, released 1 or 2 days before the federal budget, is the document that you should consult if you want to know the numbers and use them in your current affairs answers and in your Pakistan affairs answer, and maybe even in your essay. So let's have a look at the difference between federal budget and provincial budget. So first of all, the federation, the capital, the federal government announces a budget in the National Assembly. Through that budget, the government announces the total amount of revenue that it has collected in the outgoing financial year and the amount of expenditure that the government intends to make in the upcoming year. Moreover, it also translates and gives the share of the provinces according to the National Finance Commission award formula each year out of the total federal divisible pool of revenue that it has generated in the outgoing financial year, which means the previous year. So when I say financial year, I usually mean a year from July to July each year, because that is how our books and our financial accounts basically operate. So then after getting their share from the provincial revenue pool, the provinces then design their own budgets, and then they release them in their provincial assemblies, which is the budget for the province. So let's have a look at the budget, the Corona budget that has been released for 2021. So overall speaking, if we look at the nature of this budget, it has been released in an air of extreme uncertainty, in an air of very deep economic shock and high unemployment and loss of jobs and loss of substantial amount of revenue due to the coronavirus pandemic. So this budget, at least on the outwards, appears to be a budget meant for economic stimulation and economic management to rein in the massive economic loss that the pandemic has caused. So the budget is a very good document to understand the kind of economic impact that the coronavirus pandemic has had. So essentially, I believe there are three kinds of economic impacts that the coronavirus pandemic have had. The first one is the exogenous economic disruption, which is due to the global trade being halted, global value chains being coming down to a halt, and all kinds of trade activities and commerce and business all around the world have suddenly come to stop due to a complete cut down in international flights, international movement, the commerce of and the trade of and the exchange of goods, people, labor, ideas, capital. So all of this processes which run the global economy have halted due to the pandemic. So this is the exogenous economic fallout. The endogamous economic impact of the coronavirus has been the responses that governments all around the world have given to the coronavirus pandemic, which has translated into lockdowns and curfews, which have had their own economic impact, because when you lock down, you're essentially closing all business activity and commerce, which definitely results in massive job losses, loss of revenue, and even damage to the financial health of any company for that matter. And finally, the third economic impact is because of the public health crisis that the pandemic has generated, which is the number one impact of the coronavirus pandemic. Due to the public health crisis and the rapid spreading of this virus, the fact that it is the most contagious virus that we have ever seen, this has translated into a lot of productivity loss and mental health issues and absenteeism within employees, and very shy and fearful customer behavior, which has resulted in massive drop in revenue, sales across the board. So the current budget, the Corona budget, is historic in a number of ways. The most important of those is that it has the highest deficit in our history. This budget has a 7% to the GDP deficit, which we have never seen before. And this is primarily due to the 800 billion loss in revenue that would have been collected by the federal government and the Federal Board of Revenue had there been no pandemic. But because of the pandemic, the government lost nearly 800 billion rupees in revenue collection. Despite that, the government has still set the target for their next revenue generation for the financial year 2020 at nearly 5,000 billion rupees, which is quite frankly completely unachievable given the health of our economy right now, given the number of our taxpayers, and the fact that a lot of subsidies have been slashed in the budget and a lot of taxes have been reduced. So the idea that we will be able to collect more tax in the upcoming financial year that we have collected in the outgoing financial year absolutely makes no sense. But those are the projected numbers of the government, which I am sure that they will keep on revising as the months come by and they keep on bringing new mini budgets. So if we look at the total loss that the coronavirus pandemic has dealt to the economy, it comes down roughly to 3 trillion rupees, as the special assistant to Prime Minister on Revenue has recently stated. Now the total size of our economy is 40% and 40 trillion rupees, and 3 trillion rupees loss out of total 40 trillion rupees loss means a 7% loss to the GDP. This is substantial. You have no idea how deep of an economic crisis that will generate in the coming days. Now, for the first time in 50 years, for example, our GDP growth will go into the negative territory, which means that in the financial year 2020-21, according to the budget measurements and the government projections, our GDP growth will go into minus 1.2% target. Whereas IMF and World Bank predict that Pakistan's GDP will decelerate or decrease by 2.2%. So there is a whole 1% discrepancy between the numbers of the government and the international financial institutions. Now you should understand that in this case, the most reliable measure to follow and the most reliable amount of GDP growth that will happen is basically somewhere in between the two values of on one side the government and on the other side international financial institutions, because obviously the government has its own political agenda and the international financial institutions have their own international hegemonic agendas. So I would say that perhaps we will have a 1.8% negative growth for the financial year 2020 to 2021. So what does all of this mean essentially? Well, to put it very bluntly, it means collapsing growth, and perhaps to the extent that 10 years worth of progress that we have made in eradication of poverty, in improving healthcare, improving education, most of those measures could be rolled back because of this economic crisis that has been generated by the coronavirus pandemic. This also means a lot of failing businesses, plummeting exports, and massive job losses, which will directly impact the most vulnerable sections of our society, which means, as the Prime Minister Imran Khan has repeatedly said, daily wage earners. Now the government has tried substantially to help the daily wage earners during these trying times by bringing cash support programs such as the ESAS direct cash transfer program. Now that has been lauded around the world as a good initiative, but is it enough to bring the kind of economic activity that we need in order to bring our economy back on the track of progress and prosperity? No, it absolutely does not. It is just a short-term measure that is meant to contain the crisis rather than to help bring growth. Moreover, if we look at external pressures on Pakistan's economy, the oil prices around the world are stabilizing, which means that our import bill is going to increase due to the increase in prices of oil. Moreover, our debt to GDP ratio has increased to 88%. We have never seen this high debt to GDP growth before, and this is substantial. Now, the priority area in the upcoming budget has been placed on the absorbing economic loss and preventing further job loss that could create economic disaster. Now, it's not really certain how much the new budget will be able to achieve these lofty ideals, but at least the tone has been set in the right direction. For example, no new taxes have been introduced. Previous taxes have been reduced substantially. The construction sector, for example, has been one of the biggest winners, while some other industries have not gained as much from this economic shock absorber as some other industries have. Moreover, one thing important to note here is that the defense budget has once again increased by more than 11%, despite undergoing such severe economic crisis. So what we have at our hands is a classic budget that we have been seeing for nearly 30 years, where majority of our revenue is either spent in debt servicing. For example, in 2019, 30% of our total budget was for debt repayment. Secondly, the second largest head is almost always the defense budget. In the previous year, it was 20%. And then comes the development budget. Now, the development budget is one of the losers in this, budget, Corona budget, because it has lost substantial amount. However, there is some good news despite all of this grim picture that I have created for you. There has been substantial increase in social security investments and social security nets, for example, healthcare, education, unemployment benefits, and the ESAS cash transfer programs, the Corona packages, and economic growth stimulus packages for the industries, softer loans by the banks, commercial banks, state banks, and all of this means that the worst economic impact might not be felt by the most deserving people. Moreover, after the government announces its budget, the federal government, each of the province then announces their own budget. Only 2 days ago we saw Punjab's budget. That is the only budget from a province that we have seen for now. Punjab's budget paints a much better picture than the federal budget. For example, there is a 9% increase in development budget in the Punjab annual budget of financial year 2020 to 2021, and more than 70 billion rupees has been set aside for Corona efforts, and there is much greater tax relief. The taxes have been reduced, especially on medium-sized and small-scale businesses who are struggling because of the coronavirus pandemic and the ensuing lockdowns. So essentially, the budget is not as stimulus creation or as hopeful as one would hope, but that's the thing about our budgets and our economy. It's never very hopeful, but there is still some hope left. And this budget, despite being not a very welcoming budget, it's still a not bad practice. What needs to be done is a major restructuring of the entire government structure of Pakistan in terms of their financial profiles and their financial debris. A lot of money is wasted by government agencies, institutions every year. The defense budget needs to come down substantially, and we need to increase our public sector development program by a substantial amount, which should, above everything else, cover our health services, because that's where the need for intervention is the highest. Thank you very much for your patience. Keep tuned in, because in the next lecture I will be discussing how to overcome this economic crisis and what you should know being a CSS aspirant. Everything that I have discussed in this lecture so far is the extent of what you as a CSS aspirant need to learn from the budget. Thank you very much. Take care. Allah Hafiz.